Hey. I wish I could do that. Know what yeah. What I really like is how she goes, and the music stops. This is the first time I've ever had the pleasure of speaking at a church 2 Sundays in a row. No, wait, this is where you discover I only have one thing to say. But I wanted to talk today about the most important thing I learned since high school. And the setup, for those of you who weren't here last week, is that on the 20th anniversary, 20th reunion announcement of my high school graduation, there was an interesting question that was asked, namely, what's the most important thing you've learned since high school? And I loved that question. Like, can you think of that? Imagine that you got asked that question. What's the most important thing you learned since high school? And the most important thing I learned since high school was, it was kind of simple to answer, because I remember believing that how I experienced the world, how I felt inside, was simply a consequence of how my world was outside. Namely, if conditions were good, I felt good. If conditions were bad, I felt bad. If I was getting what I wanted, things are great. And if I wasn't getting what I wanted, things are terrible. If I'm not feeling well, I'm feeling terrible. If I'm feeling okay, I'm feeling okay. You all know that. You've been there. And the most important thing I learned was that my feelings, my words, my beliefs have at least as effect effect on the outer world as the outer world has on my feelings, my beliefs. And I remember not knowing that. And in fact, I remember the moment when it crashed open. It was in December of 1969, and a lot of things in my life then were falling apart. And I spent some time at a growth center in Big Sur called the Esalen Institute. And I was working with a crazy man named John Lilly. John Lilly, for those of you who know, is the man who spoke to dolphins. He did a lot of LSD research. I don't know that he gave LSD to dolphins, but they seemed pretty high. And he had us lying down. We were in Fritz Perl's cabin, and we were lying down on the ground, a small group, on the floor, and he was playing a sound on rather sophisticated sound equipment. I mean, today you could do it with a speaker this size, but that was tape equipment, reel-to-reel, and very large speakers. And he had us lie down and he said, just listen. And there was a sound, a constant sound like a jet engine taking off. And then, in the midst of the sound, I heard a guitar solo, an acoustical guitar playing classical music. It was gorgeous. And then I heard the orchestra behind the guitar And it was amazing that even with that rushing sound, that continual rushing sound, I was able to hear so clearly. And particularly then, I was not particularly a fan of classical music, so I didn't know what the selection was that was being played, but it was magnificent. I was impressed with how sophisticated a sound equipment would have to be to have it was an acoustical guitar, the acoustical guitar and the full orchestra able to be heard in the midst of that sound. And then it was over and we sat up and we were to share what we had heard. And as I listened to what people were sharing, I was shocked to discover that nobody heard the guitar and nobody heard the orchestra. And at first I thought, well, they weren't listening. And then I realized, lo and behold, there was no guitar and there was no orchestra in the sound. All there was in the sound, Lily said, was something called pink noise. It's the opposite, like, of white noise. Now, for me, that orchestra and that guitar were there. It was not even a question. But that raised a question for me that had never been raised before. And that is, how much of what I'm seeing and how much of what I'm experiencing and how much of what I'm believing is coming from out there and how much is coming from in here? And how the hell do I know the difference? You know, this notion that we have a shared reality. We live in this shared reality. And all of a sudden it gets pierced by the notion that if I affect my reality, if what's in my consciousness affects my reality, then that same thing is happening to everybody around. Who knows what they're thinking? Who knows what they're believing? Who knows what they're seeing? Who knows what they're hearing? OMG. I was learning the power of belief, and I was learning the power of words, because ultimately we couch our beliefs, we frame our beliefs with words. In the Hebrew language, the word for word is davar. Davar is word, devarim are words, plural. But davar also means thing. So in the language, a word is a thing. It's a problem. Because when we consider the nature of our reality and the nature of ourselves a little more carefully, we come to the conclusion that we are not only creatures of words, but we are creations of words. Words are our greatest ally, and words are our greatest enemies. When a child is growing up, we wait for them to start speaking, do we not? And we urge them on from goo-goo, boo-boo sounds to mommy, daddy sounds. And when they start speaking, we're overjoyed. Of course, a year or two later, we're trying to get them to shut up. But at the beginning, we are telling them the most magnificent thing they could possibly do is speak words. And what are the words which announce they're coming into themselves as individual beings? That's it. No. No, I don't want that. great. We frame our identity with two words in particular. Sometimes I think the whole thing boils down to two words, and one is no and one is yes. One is I want and the other is I don't want. One is more and one is John Lilly said, in the province of the mind, whatever limits exist are to be discovered experientially and experimentally. And then any beliefs about the limits that are then discovered are themselves beliefs to be transcended. He said, in the province of the mind, there are no limits. Because what that means is the lives we are living, the feelings we are nurturing, the experiences we are having are dependent on the beliefs and the words we are using to express those beliefs. And we are always talking. We're always talking. Even when we shut our mouths, we're talking. Are you aware of that? Like the clearest way to become aware of that is to be quiet. I love it when people say, I close my eyes, I go into absolute silence, and I am in awe of such a person. My belief is they're not listening. Because as far as I can tell, the first thing that happens when we go into silence is that we discover we're talking to ourselves all the time. But when we're in our regular operating consciousness, we're talking so fast we can't hear ourselves. So we start in silence, we start to meditate. People always say, I can't meditate because as soon as I start meditating, my mind goes faster. It's exactly opposite. As soon as I start meditating, my mind starts slowing down. So by golly, I can hear what I'm talking. And frankly, if I had a friend who was talking to me like my inner voice talks to me, I would not stay around with that friend very long. This month's theme is will. I know that because there's a sign up there. I catch on, last week it was love, this week will. I will love. But will is a weird thing. We frame our days and we frame ourselves through affirmations. And it doesn't matter whether you've ever heard of the word affirmation or ever practiced consciously an affirmation, we are always affirming something. And most of our affirmations start with the word that has the greatest power. And the words that have the greatest power are I am. How could it not? That's the name of God. When Moses is in the wilderness at the burning bush and he asks God, what's your name? Which is great. It's the only time anybody asks God, what's your name? And the answer Moses gets is, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. I am as I am. I am absolutely beyond any particular predication. I am just I am. It's we who take that I am and particularize it. I am here, I am there, I am happy, I am sad, I am old, I am young, I am fat, I am thin. And by golly, we make that true. And we get confused. Is the world making that true, or are we making that true? And so we test it by doing a conscious affirmation. And I know that all of you in here have done conscious affirmations, and you've felt the reality of that. Do you do them all the time? Do you ever wonder why you don't? Really? Do you ever wonder why you don't observe, practice all the wisdom that you know? We go on automatic. I'm too busy. I got too many things on my schedule. I'm tired. There is that structure within us that we have built up with our words that really doesn't want to change very much. And for those of you who are in any way in a psychotherapeutic field, you know with certainty when people come in and say, I want to change, you know they're going to do everything in their power to make sure they don't. If that were not so, they would have changed. It's all dealing with our resistances. I'll tell you where I learned affirmations. It was from a teacher named Anthony Norvell. Has anybody ever heard of him? One person. This was a guy in Southern California. I went to see him. He wore white. His hair looked like it had black shoe polish on it. And I guess he gave metaphysical lectures. I'd never heard such a thing before. It was great. But he wrote a book called The Cosmic Secrets of the Telecosmic, wait a minute. The Telecosmic Secrets of The Secrets of Telecosmic Power, something like that. I knew I'd never forget that title. But this was now the early 70s, and these are the instructions he gave for doing an affirmation. You write your affirmation. You might have 1, 2, or 3. You don't want to do too many. You frame them as if you are saying something that is already true. Because if the universe responds to our affirmations, and if I say I want to lose weight, the universe will go, okay, you want to lose weight, and will keep us wanting. So the affirmation has to be either I am losing weight, or I am the perfect weight. However the affirmation goes, whatever feels right. But he says, take your affirmation, however long it happens to be, and read it out loud 7 times in the morning. And then shorten it to just a word or two. Like if you're doing healing, shorten it to I heal. If you're doing, whatever you're doing, shorten it to just an I and a word, or I am and a word, so that during the day, when you're driving, when you're walking, when you're in line, you can simply repeat those short phrases. You don't have to remember the whole affirmation. You just repeat those, you sing them, you chant them, whenever you have a moment. Because if you recite it aloud to yourself 7 times, that's in your subconscious already. So if you just repeat the 2 words, counts as the whole thing. And then at night, you again recite them 7 times, aloud. Try it. But you got to be real careful about how you frame your affirmations. Sometimes I think what I do in the spiritual therapy practice is edit people's affirmations, because we sabotage ourselves in such interesting ways. Because the very personality that is a construct of words has a tendency of fearing change, even when that change is something we want, even if that change is something that will help us feel better, even if that change is something that will support us in our lives, in our relationships, in our work. There's a part of all of us that kind of gets terrified of change. And you know why? Because the structure of the personality got built up to help us survive in the world in which we grew. This is really crucial. And it worked. Obviously, for all of us, it worked. We're here. So the subconscious feels it's a threat to change that operating procedure. Because how can we be assured that those changes, in fact, will support our survival when all the evidence tells us that the way we've been doing it assures our survival? Would we rather survive unhappily or not survive at all? And the ego knows. The ego knows something that we tend to forget, and that is the only way we can control our experience is to expect the negative. The ego can always find something wrong. And it's amazing how natural it is for us to focus on that when there could be a million positive things. I remember giving sermons in the old days, and a bunch of people would tell me how great a sermon it was, and one person would come up and be critical of what I said, and when I drove home, I realized I've got that person in my head. Man, remarkable, remarkable. Just to notice how the ego thrives, because that allows it to protect itself against change. So here's my plea. Be really gentle on your egos. Be real gentle on yourselves. And don't fight resistance. Don't fight against the fears. Don't fight against the tendency, not to do the practice. Beat yourself up and you'll be stuck there forever. Love yourself even with, or especially with, those fears, and our lives shift. Because our lives always shift out of love and acceptance. And our lives don't shift out of resistance, denial, repression, suppression. I don't blame you, dear ego. Replace ego with your name. I don't blame you, dear Ted. I don't blame you, dear Ted, for being reluctant to change. You have every reason to fear change. However, there's something here, and there's someone here now who you've forgotten about. And the one you've forgotten about is the one who created your personality, created out of words in the first place. And that's the self we want to give the words of affirmation to. And that's the self we want to love our ego with. Because the ego can't love itself. The ego can only love itself when it feels good about itself. But that one behind the ego that one who formed the ego, that creative self that's always here, but so often neglected because we keep buying. We buy the pitch of our personality. It's a wonderful thing. But each and every one of us is more than that. So, first I'd like to allow you to hear the voice, invite you to hear the voice, okay? So the simplest way to do that is for me to shut up. And just take a gentle breath and close your eyes. And be aware. Be aware of whatever's going on in your body, places of tension, places of ease. Be aware of anything you're feeling. Perhaps there are memories. Perhaps there are desires.